Cranbrook. What began at the start of the 20th century as a private retreat for George and Ellen Booth, a home in the countryside north of Detroit, was slowly transformed by the visionary couple into a center of art, science, and education. First, George Booth designed the Meeting House, now Brookside School, where church services and nursery school classes were held by 1918. Then the Booths built Christ Church Cranbrook, with its soaring bell tower rising above the quickly changing landscape of farms transforming into suburban estates. As work on the church continued, the Booths established Cranbrook School for Boys, its charming quadrangles welcoming boarding and day students for classes in September of 1927. Across the valley, Ellen Booth's determined vision propelled the building of Kingswood School for Girls, dedicated in 1931, a place where young women studied and lived in an environment of exquisite beauty. The Institute of Science opened its doors to the public in 1938. Here, gems and minerals were displayed, flora and fauna studied, and the heavens observed. And the project closest to George Booth's heart, Cranbrook Academy of Art. Growing from a center of handicraft in 1928 to a powerhouse of art, architecture, and design by 1942, when the last major project of the Booths opened its doors, Cranbrook Art Museum. And it is here, as around the entire campus, that we find the architecture and landscape enhanced by the work of a singular genius, Carl Milles. George Booth, a metalsmith turned newspaper publisher, and Ellen Scripps Booth, heir to the fortune secured by the Detroit News, created Cranbrook through their vision and generosity. Embodying the philosophies of the arts and crafts movement, their home, Cranbrook House, exemplifies the edict to have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. In 1928, Booth set out to create his vision of an ideal artistic community, establishing the Cranbrook Arts and Crafts Studios. Within these workshops, the blacksmith was hard at work, creating gates and andirons for the campus. The silversmith hammered out everything from chalices to cigarette cases. And the cabinet maker labored over elaborate furniture. And under the watchful eye of designer Loija Saarinen, skilled Swedish immigrant weavers executed rugs, window draperies, and textiles. The architect of these studios and the leader of this new enterprise that would evolve into Cranbrook Academy of Art was Eliel Saarinen, a renowned architect and designer who, at age 50, immigrated with his family from their native Finland to the American Midwest. In his first building for Cranbrook, the School for Boys, Saarinen demonstrated his guiding philosophy, his belief that the architect must, as he wrote, always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. A chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan. What is particularly clear from Saarinen's early models of Cranbrook, there would be a great need for sculptures to adorn the buildings and grounds of this ambitious institution.
The story of how Carl Milles landed at Cranbrook is a fascinating one, a courtship, if you will, between the sculptor and his patron, George Booth. It was actually difficult for Booth to convince Milles to move from Sweden to Cranbrook. Milles was, after all, at the height of his fame. Milles's journey to becoming a sculptor was not a direct one. After a restless childhood in the late 1890s, he headed off for a new adventure in distant Chile to work at a Swedish gymnasium. Along the way, and luckily for all of us, he stopped in Paris and continued no further. With scant resources but innate talent, he began to practice sculpture and eventually became an assistant to the renowned French sculptor Auguste Rodin. In 1905, he married the Austrian artist Olga Granner, known for her portraiture, and the newlyweds soon moved to Sweden, where Carl's reputation as a sculptor started to grow. On a trip to America in 1929, George Booth welcomed the Swedish sculptor as a visitor to Cranbrook. Booth almost immediately invited Millis to join his growing community of artists as sculptor in residence, but Millis implied he was not interested. Still, Cranbrook so impressed him, he offered Booth a gift, his Triton fountain, and Booth, in return, purchased Millis's sun glitter. In Cranbrook archives, we can read the letters between the two men as they go back and forth for over a year. When Millis said he did not want to teach, Booth responded by telling him he would simply be expected to offer reasonable encouragement, counsel, and criticism. Booth then attempted to sweeten the deal, offering to purchase sculptures and promising ample studio space. While Millis increasingly came to believe that his future commissions and his future glory lay on this side of the Atlantic, he nevertheless still continued to resist Booth's offer. Negotiations ended with a curt ultimatum in a telegram from Booth to Millis. "We'll expect you after New Year's." The now or never demand worked, and Carl and Olga arrived in America in January of 1931. American critics took notice of his arrival. They referred to Millis as the heir to Bernini, famous for his fountains, while the largesse of George Booth was described in Life magazine as surpassing the princely courts of Renaissance Italy. Here, Millis was positioned as a rising sculptor in America and Cranbrook Academy of Art as a leading center for arts education.
With Millis agreeing to relocate to Michigan, the Detroit News reported on the sculptor's impending arrival. It is hard to estimate the significance of the coming of Mr. Millis to America for a period of residence, for Mr. Millis is undoubtedly one of the outstanding figures in all contemporary art. When they arrived in early 1931, Carl and Olga Millis joined a growing cohort of immigrant artists and artisans at Cranbrook, including other Swedes like Tore Berglund, renowned for his furniture at Stockholm City Hall, who ran the Cranbrook cabinet shop, while his frequent collaborator in Sweden, weaver Maya Anderson Verde, came to America expressly to serve as the supervisor and a designer for Studio Loya Saarinen. Other Swedish immigrant weavers, all trained in Sweden's special handicraft schools in Stockholm or Bastad, provided the skills necessary to operate the Cranbrook looms. Some, like Lillian Holm and Ruth Ingvarsson, would have long careers teaching and weaving at Cranbrook. While these artists lived and worked in around the arts and crafts studios, Carl and Olga Millis moved next door to the Saarinens into a newly completed home and studio with pride of place along Academy Way. This grand building served as both Carl Millis's American home and studio, and as a center of the Millis's rich intellectual and social life. To be a visitor to Millis's house was to step into the mind of the artist. In his living room, it was ancient sculptures, not furniture, that took pride of place. He called this his library and told visitors that Voltaire had 5,000 books, but I learn every day from my Greeks. As he described to one reporter, "I borrow from these works. Simplicity is the secret of fine sculpture, and these ancients knew it." His prized collection of ancient sculpture not only informed Millis's work, but served as the entertainment at elaborate teas and dinners. Coveted invitations brought students and visitors into Millis's domain, where, flashlight in hand, he spent hours with enraptured listeners, examining details of the statues and unraveling the mysteries of their form. His voice was low and musical, and speaking slowly, he would ask his visitors, "Have you ever seen a room like this?" Millis always ended his ruminations with a piercing glance at his audience and his favorite phrase, "Isn't it wonderful?" Arched doorways led out to the verdant courtyard, which, like the living room, was filled with ancient artifacts arranged by Millis. Summer lunches were served on Roman marble tables, and the conversation ranged, as one guest described, from classical myths and religion to the cosmos and love, Napoleon and Mozart, Turner's sunsets, and Rome's glories. The Detroit News reported that when the Swedish sculptor puts aside his work each afternoon, he wants hot coffee and good talk. The host likes laughter and pleases his guests with stories of the far-off places he has lived in and people he has known. Enchanting dinners took place in the glowing interior of the dining room, outfitted with paintings in soft pastels by Swedish artist Henning Malmström, and classically inspired furniture from Sweden's most celebrated maker, Carl Malmsten. Atop the table, hand-woven linens from Studio Loja Saarinen were embroidered with the Millis' monogram. Below, hand-knotted Rhea rugs designed by Millis and woven by Mrs. Saarinen's Swedish weavers tied the interiors together. While at the window, open-weave curtains framed views back toward the gardens. It was here, at home, where Millis could relax, philosophize, and study his beloved antiquities. But just steps away, behind the curtains, was where the real magic and passion of Carl Millis was on full display. Here, in his home studio, one of 3 workspaces Cranbrook provided its most eminent artist, was where Millis would begin new sculptures. He rarely started with sketches. Instead, he visualized the completed work and created a small clay model. This would be enlarged by one of Millis' many assistants to 1/3 of the size of the finished work. Millis then tackled the larger clay model, making anything from tiny changes to radical reforms. His team again mechanically enlarged the work to its final size, and, once again, Millis pored over the sculpture, still not hesitating to incorporate new ideas. The completed clay model would then be cast in plaster and sent to the bronze foundry, usually the Royal Swedish Bronze Casting Company led by Herman Bergman in Stockholm. Olga Millis too played a part in her husband's process, as remembered by Millis' student and friend Svea Klein.
Well, you see, he would never leave his studio until Olga had come in and given him a critique. And he got very upset first, but then he came back and said, "Dear little Olga, you were right. What you said was right."
In this vast main studio, some 100 feet long and 35 feet high, Millis could create at full scale his largest public commissions. While the magic of Millis' studio lay in the process of making, it was on the growing campus where one experienced the genius of the artist in full force.
What impresses me about the Carl Millis sculptures across Cranbrook are not just their individual beauty, but how, as a collection, they weave together the different parts of the campus. And it's no accident that every campus building designed by Eliel Saarinen features Millis' bronzes. It is one of the great architect-sculptor relationships in art history, though also one of the most unusual. You see, most of these sculptures weren't made for Cranbrook. George Booth orchestrated the expensive decision in 1934 to purchase some 41 sculptures, or 60 individual pieces, of Millis' work. The wholesale importation of a single sculptor's body of work meant that Saarinen was designing Cranbrook's campus with specific sculptures in mind. Here at the Art Museum, we experience a sophisticated arrangement of buildings, pathways, landscape, and sculpture. Europa and the Bull look out across the Triton pools, and this important axis seems to extend clear across the water into infinity. And the timeline of construction of this composition is really quite surprising. The sculptures were created in the 1920s, purchased in 34, and the Tritons installed in a formal garden designed by Loija Saarinen in 1935. Yet the pools weren't poured as concrete basins until 2 years later, when Europa and the Orpheus fountains were installed. And it was still another few years before the museum and library building was finally realized in 1942. While our eyes can look up and across the impressive front vista toward the museum, the building becomes all the more remarkable when you finally arrive. Here, Saarinen peppers sculptures by Millis and Millis's assistant, Marshall Fredericks, across the stairs and into the open peristyle in an irregular and highly original way. For instance, the Folkefilbeter sits on a plinth designed by Saarinen that matches the building's meandering stonework lines and geometric bronze doors. While the fountains and pools are grand and symmetrical, as you get closer to the museum, the sculptures become more intimate and conversational. We can look the Folkefilbeter directly in the eye and see the anguish as he searches for his abducted grandson. Nearby, Folkefilbeter appears again, this time at full scale, but just his torso, raised up high so his sharp gaze is looking down at us. He sits on an elaborate sculptural plinth, again with those stone meanders, and it's a composition that blurs the line between sculpture and architecture. Millis's work, then, is the art which Saarinen's monumental museum visually extols. The sculpture is not simply decoration applied to the building. Instead, the sculptures tie the campus together and inspires the entire creative enterprise of the Cranbrook vision.
As Eliel Saarinen said at the time of the 1934 purchase of Millis's sculptures, the acquisition of this collection will make Cranbrook one of the great beauty spots in this country and will add greatly to its importance as an art center. Indeed, everywhere on campus, Millis's work found sympathetic and harmonious positions. Millis sculpted figures from classical mythology like naiads, nymphs who guard over fresh water, or the chasing hounds of Diana, goddess of the hunt, or Pan, god of shepherds and music. And with playful streams of water that so entranced Millis, joyous mermaids and tritons. His passion for Scandinavian history is reflected in figures like Ingelbrecht, the medieval Swedish warrior and liberator, or Sven Hedin, Swedish geographer and explorer. Millis was a lover of nature and gave as much attention to his animal figures as to the creatures that might latch onto them. Other animals are more than they first appear. The running horse was, as Millis wrote, a portrait of myself running without a rider. Religion provided further subject matter. Here, Millis dramatized the conversion of St. Paul and conveys the rich emotion of the subject through sinuous muscle, swirling fabric, and tight composition. And always, the power of each sculpture is enhanced through its architectural context. The Jonah Fountain stands as Millis's only sculpture at Cranbrook, made specifically for Cranbrook. As Millis wrote, Jonah was the first thing I started here at Cranbrook. When I started it, I didn't know what to do, but wanted to make a joke for the children. I thought it would be right to have Jonah appearing with a surprised look on his face. For its installation in the fall of 1932, Herman Bergman accompanied the fountain from his Stockholm foundry to Bloomfield Hills. He directed the crane operator, who swung the enormous fountain into place and oversaw the connections of 80 small pipes to jubilantly spray jets of water from the fishes and whale. Jonah was, in fact, commissioned for the courtyard of Kingswood School for Girls, a location deemed too small for this monumental fountain. Instead, the dramatic entrance of Kingswood frames Diana, the lyrical dancing goddess. Generations of Cranbrook students have looked out of their sprawling school toward the dancing girls, flitting toward the sky aside Kingswood Lake. Beyond his sculptures here, Millis had a special place in the life of Kingswood students. On unforgettable field trips across campus, the young girls visited Millis in his studio. The class of 1949 even elected to have Millis serve as their honoree for their class ring ceremony, which then took place in Millis's grand studio. Kingswood also served as the backdrop for Millis's memorable 70th birthday celebration, a chance for the community to gather together in celebration of its great sculptor and artist in residence. Melinda Booth, granddaughter of George and Ellen, helped ring in Millis's 7th decade. As important as myth, history, and religion were to Millis, there are also great moments of levity in his work, as in his charming moose, sculpted around 1923 and installed many decades later in Brookside's Vlasic Early Childhood Center. One of Millis's most distinctly American sculptures, the Ice Princess, was inspired by a visit to Rockefeller Center's iconic skating rink. Sculpted at Cranbrook around 1948, this edition was cast in Sweden by the Herman Bergman Fine Art Bronze Foundry in 2012 for the new middle school for girls, ensuring every Cranbrook building holds a Carl Millis sculpture. And at the Art Museum, one of Cranbrook's most indelible images is Millis's iconic Orpheus Fountain, rising from a circular pool amid the mists and spray. This group is just a portion of a much larger fountain sculpted at Cranbrook for the Stockholm Concert Hall. Orpheus himself, the musician from Greek mythology, was never installed at Cranbrook as his enormous scale was thought to be too tall next to the museum's columned peristyle. Nevertheless, the ring of 8 figures embodies the best of Millis's work: a strong composition, dynamic forms and emotive faces, and a flirtatious combination of water, sculpture, sight, and sky.
Archives are what allow us to go beyond the physical buildings and sculptures on campus and understand the full story of this special place. Within the collections of Cranbrook Archives, Carl and Olga Millis are represented in all manner of interesting ways. While we don't hold the complete archives of Millis, which are in Sweden, we treasure the sketches by Carl Millis that we do have, including a study of a bear for the unrealized Spirit of the Forest Fountain, ceremonial bronze doors in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, sketched within letters to the building's architect, and one of my favorites, For God Our Father on the Rainbow. Originally, Millis titled the work, Lord on the Rainbow, Placing New Stars on Heaven. What I find most revealing within our holdings are the connections we see between Millis and his friends, co-workers, and students. Particularly, we can see the strong friendship between our founders and Millis in places like the inscribed monograph of Millis's work from the Booth Library, or the wonderful birthday card for Ellen's 80th birthday with sketches by Carl. We can see how Millis was not only a mentor, but developed lifelong friendships with students in a scrapbook assembled by Millis's Swedish-American student, Nona Suderlind. In the archives, we have oral history interviews with many of Millis's Cranbrook peers, including Marshall Fredericks, who was an assistant to Carl and instructor at Cranbrook, and went on to an illustrious career as a sculptor in Detroit.
The acid oxidizes the bronze, turning it to a light green. More applications of acid follow until the right depth of color enriches the great bronze casting. The Spirit of Detroit, a 16-foot bronze statue at the City-County Building, a statue that stands for all those ties which bind a city and its people together.
There's also Richard Askew, our photographer in the 30s. These tapes really breathe life into the written and photographic record.
But he inspected everything. He looked at it and would discard it if it wasn't right, wasn't what he wanted. It'd just be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
He was like Elo Center. They had a vision that they could visualize a complete concept.
Askew traveled the country photographing Millis's installations. As a result, the archives has wonderful documentation of projects in St. Louis, Delaware, New York, and elsewhere. It's really through these records that we can understand the life and impact of Millis on the story of Cranbrook, and more broadly on the history of sculpture. In addition to illuminating his artistic process, the breadth of our collection allows us to see Millis as a person and not simply as the creator of beautiful objects.
Carl and Olga Millis returned each summer to Millisgarden, their home in Sweden, and where, in the twilight of his career, Millis moved permanently in 1951. As one observer of both sites wrote, "Cranbrook is woods, lawns, and ponds. Millisgarden is sky, cliff, and water." Cranbrook stands as a 300-acre composition of sculpture, nature, and architecture. A total work of art. While the daily life of those on campus is varied and ever-changing, the work of Millis stands eternal. Whether cast in bronze or carved in stone, these sculptures are anything but mute. Through the skill of Carl Millis, they are alive.